Hey everyone, so we're going to talk about rights in this video. So in particular, I want to talk about the right to privacy, and we don't really have a definition of privacy rights in the US. Now, other countries may. In fact, I believe in the EU there's something called the right to be left alone and the right to be forgotten, which is about privacy rights. And I encourage you to look those up and what that exactly means. So, the right to privacy is really a question about whether or not privacy exists in our existing definition of rights. And some people say that it does exist as an extension of property rights. So if we talk about privacy in the sense of somebody's come into my home, I did not invite them into my home, I do not want them here, and they have invaded my private space, my private sphere. Then we can say that they've also violated my property rights. They have violated my right to property of the house that I live in, or the apartment, or whatever it is that you live in. And that is a violation of property rights that is not necessarily tied to our right to privacy. It's tied to our right to property instead. Now, there's another way to look at this as well. If we're in public, that we have a right to privacy in the sense of we have a right, again, to our personal property, but also a right to self, right? I said right a lot there. So if we have a right to ourselves and our own person, then people touching us or otherwise interacting with us in a way that violates that is not just a violation of our our privacy rights that we might innately consider ourselves to have, but also a violation of our rights to ourselves, to our bodily autonomy. And that's important to realize is that the right to privacy is highly tied to the other things that we do in public and in the world. It's not necessarily something that is directly tied to an intrinsic right, at least not the way we see it here in the US. Now, there is some people who say that we should have an intrinsic right to privacy. Privacy in and of itself should be a right. And this is where I'm going to bring up the EU again with the right to be left alone. And the idea behind the right to be left alone is if you're in public, you have a right to not be harassed. That's basically what it is. So if you're a celebrity, for instance, you have a right to not be followed around all the time by paparazzi. That is one way to take a look at privacy rights. This is another extension of that privacy life. So I want to be able to walk around in public without necessarily being followed and have that be an intrinsic right that I am not followed. I have some privacy in my ongoings throughout the public sphere, even though I am in public. Another way to look at this is the right to be forgotten. So the right to be forgotten is about mostly about doing something stupid and it getting documented on the internet. This can be in the way of a criminal act, right? So you did something, it resulted in a criminal case, you got your mugshot into a newspaper, and it's been 10 years and you try to go get a job and you can't get one because they did a Google search on your name and that's the first thing that popped up. And they're like, oh, we don't want that person here because they, committed a crime. Which is a fairly normal reaction from a company. Whether or not you consider that to be fair is a different conversation. But it is a fairly normal, action from a company to go, oh, you have criminal background, we don't want you to work here. The right to be forgotten basically says that after a certain period of time, stories like this should disappear. You have a right to be forgotten in terms of things you've done in the past can stay there to an extent. This doesn't mean that everything you do has a right to be forgotten, but some things you do have that right. And it also doesn't extend necessarily to everybody. I believe in the EU, the way this works is that if you are a public figure and you do something in the capacity of your role of government, for example, if you're a political figure, then you do not have the right to be forgotten extended to those actions. Instead, it's only to certain private life aspects. So maybe you did something stupid and you, again, got your mugshot in the local newspaper. You have a right for that to eventually go away. And this is actually implemented in the EU to some extent, and it's important to understand how difficult this can exactly be in the current age with as much social media as we have and as much uh, basically just information we have to access, right? If I want to find out about somebody, I can do a Google search on their name. I can find out so much information from them. Uh, and that's a little scary. And we expect to have certain privacy on those things that we just don't anymore. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in some later videos. But the idea here is that what our rights exactly are regarding privacy are in a lot more flux right now than they were 10 to 20 years ago. And I know for most of you, that's before you can remember. But it's important to realize that we still haven't addressed the changes that technology has caused in the sense of this private life aspect and this private sphere. What exactly do I have a right to have private? And everybody has different views on privacy. Some people think that it doesn't matter, we have no privacy anyway, so why do we even bother? And I would say to those people, well, you enjoy being able to go to the bathroom without people watching you, right? To get changed, to go home, to cook your food, to have this, private sphere, this private circle that you live in. And we also expect people to not necessarily follow us around or harass us, right? These are things that are privacy rights. And this is something that we want to extend to our internet life, our information age life, right? There is a certain extent to which we expect to have privacy controls on our internet life, on our social media, and on other things that we do. It's important that we try to address these issues and concerns because it's becoming more and more important that we understand them in our current day and age. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how trust plays a role in privacy. So, trust is a big part of whether or not we consider something to be private, right? So, I have a certain level of trust with certain friends that if they drop by my house at any particular time, I'm never going to be upset. They can just walk into my home because I trust them that much. They're never invading my privacy when they do that because I have already extended my zone of accessibility to include them, right? This is about trust. Now, if I didn't know somebody, I'm not extending that zone of accessibility to them. There's only certain people that I trust to do that. Some of you may have childhood friends when you were in high school where you would just walk into each other's homes without even knocking or without saying anything. That's not necessarily uncommon. We have this zone of trust that we extend to certain people, and we trust people to hold our private lives as, you know, private amongst their other circles. We don't extend just because we trust our neighbor to be able to come into our home unannounced does not mean we trust them to bring somebody with them into our home. There's a difference between how far that trust goes and who exactly we are trusting. This is really important because this is involved again with our social media lives and the age of information. If I trust, for example, Facebook with my data, that does not necessarily mean I am trusting whoever they want to sell my data to. I have trusted Facebook explicitly and I want them to handle that data with care. Now, we know that Facebook is not necessarily doing that after some of the information that came out during the last election cycle. And it's important to understand that that amount of trust that we have for these online services is going to wax and wane based off of events that we know, in particular, how they relate to cybersecurity. And security is a big part of our trust. We trust certain people with our credit card information, right? Certain vendors, certain online stores such as Amazon. We trust that they're going to hold our information private so our identity doesn't get stolen. And we trust them in part because they're supposed to have good security measures. So this trust is important. in extending what our zone of accessibility is to people, as well as extending our zone of accessibility into online services. Now, there's a good example of how trust plays a role with privacy in a slightly different way in your book, where it talks about new parents and a new babysitter. And it's important that you understand there are a lot of aspects to this trust bit, but it's also really important to understand that this trust has to extend in different ways to an online community than it does to in-person communities. Now, next, we're going to talk about information disclosures, cookies, and data mining. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some other things just to wrap up. So next video is going to be information disclosures, cookies, and data mining.